Okay, so we're going to start recording, and let's pull up this this video. This is substrate utilization, take one, starting in 3, 2. Now I'd like to start talking about substrate utilization. Substrate utilization refers to essentially why you use either fats or carbohydrates primarily, but also protein, at any given point throughout exercise or at any point in your life. Okay, so we've talked about the different systems, the bioenergetic systems, be it immediate or glycolytic or oxidative, but now we're going to start talking about when and under what conditions your body utilizes those systems preferentially. So, essentially, the major determinants for substrate utilization can be boiled down to a few key factors. Those things, namely, being intensity of exercise, okay, intensity, availability of substrate, okay, so that has to do with, one, how much of it did you have to begin with? Let's say in the case of glucose or glycogen, if I started out being glycogen depleted or having low glycogen to start with, well, then I'm going to have low availability, right, because my supply is low, and that's going to influence whether or not I'm using that energy system. And then duration of work, okay, because if I'm working for a longer time, I will consequently be burning up fuel as I go. So throughout exercise, as we'll see, you're going to have shifting of usage of carbohydrates to fats because carbohydrates tend to run out. So if you don't have a substrate, then it's difficult for your body, of course, to run the energy systems which rely on that substrate. And then the other thing, key thing here, is training status. Okay, so training status speaks to, well, how well trained you are. And typically, when we talk about bioenergetics, we're talking about training status. The typical assumption is that we're talking about endurance training. Not to say that people who do power events or anaerobic activities don't have their own bioenergetic concerns, but typically as we go forward here, we're talking about someone who's trained versus untrained. Unless otherwise specified, assume that we're talking about someone who is doing endurance type work. Okay. So this here, the crossover concept. This is the meat and potatoes of this unit. Hold on a second. Let me full screen this for us. Okay. So the crossover concept is the meat and potatoes. Okay, that is probably the most core thing of substrate utilization. Okay, and it's graphically depicted this way, and this is actually why they call it the crossover concept. All right. So if we look at this graph, let's break it down a little bit. Okay. So on our y-axis here, we have percentage of energy coming from fats and carbohydrate. Okay. So in blue here we have carbs. Okay. CHO. Right. And in pink here we have fat. Right. So, and then on our our x-axis down here, we have percentage of VO2 max. All right. So a different way that we could say this is, instead of saying in percentage of VO2 max, we could say intensity. Okay. So because if I'm working at a certain percentage of my VO2 max, then I'm working at a specific intensity. All right. So as intensity goes up, we have a shift in substrate utilization. Let's dumpster all these. Okay. So as I'm just sitting here right now, I'm talking into a microphone and I'm recording this video. My workload is very low, so I'm right around here. All right. So right now, the percentage of fat utilization versus carbohydrate might look something like this. Okay, so I'm burning, say, about 70-ish% fat and maybe just a little bit more, say above 30% carbohydrate. At no point are you burning a single substrate unless you've got something very extreme happening in your body. So, but for the most part, you're pretty much always at some percentage of this. Now, as I start to increase my work, and I start working harder, moving along this x-axis here, what we see is that the amount of energy we derive from fat starts to go down, while the amount of energy we derive from carbohydrate goes up. And as we go to this final point here, 100% or maximal aerobic capacity, you'll see that fat utilization down here is basically non-existent. You are, of course, still metabolizing some fat, but its contribution to your total energy production is insignificant. Whereas carbohydrates up here are pretty much supplying all the energy. Okay, not all, but close to all the energy. All right, and that's the core of the crossover concept. And as we talk more about this and we go into this unit a bit more, what we're going to see is there's things that will modulate this kind of crossover concept a bit. But this is kind of the core of this. All right. So the first key to all of this is intensity. All right. The harder you work, the more you burn carbohydrate. The more relaxed you are, or the lower your energy demand is another way to say it, the more you're able to burn fat. Okay. And part of the reasoning for that, and one of the mechanisms for that, is if we look at the actual bioenergetic pathway of glycolysis, the faster we start working, the harder we start working, right? As we go further higher up in our VO2 max, we start needing energy faster. Okay? And if we need energy fast, if we think back to the glycolytic system, what we see is that we start producing lactic acid. So that's the next slide here. Okay? If I'm producing high amounts of lactic acid, well, lactic acid actually has an inhibitory effect on lipolysis. Remembering back again, lipolysis is the process of breaking down triglycerides. Okay? So if I have fat stored in adipose cells around my body, and in order for me to break those fat cells up and break up those adipose cells a bit and release fatty acids, that's the process of lipolysis. I need to break the triglycerides and anyway, lactic acid, when it's infused into the body, when it hits the bloodstream, when it interacts with an adipose cell, it sends a signal to that adipose cell to stop performing lipolysis and indeed actually create fat. So it's lipogenic, in fact. So you have this kind of competing message of lactic acid telling fat cells to store fat, whereas you have other hormones and exercise-derived factors leading to lipolysis. So the more lactic acid that's hitting the system, the less lipolysis is happening. And if there's less fat in the blood, if there's less fat being released through lipolysis, then there's less fat available to be picked up by the muscle, right? And so if you don't have the capacity to even pull up that substrate into the muscle cell, well, then it's exceptionally difficult for that muscle cell to burn that substrate, right? Because it's not around. So this graph here shows an experiment that was done where they had people exercise, okay, and then they also infused lactic acid, okay, and here we look at our axes, okay, we have fatty acids. So this is fatty acids in the blood, all right, on our y-axis, and the x-axis here shows the amount of lactic acid that's in the blood as well. So what we see here is as lactic acid levels increase, okay, as lactic acid levels go up, okay, we see a decrease in fatty acids, okay, so it's an inverse relationship, free fatty acids, right? So that's one of the reasons that you see a drop in fat utilization as you start working harder, all right? simply because if I start working harder and producing lactic acid, that lactic acid directly reduces the amount of fatty acids in my blood, and if it's not in my blood, it's not accessible to the muscle. If it's not accessible, you can't burn it. Okay, so this graph kind of takes that crossover concept, but it gives it a little bit more depth. All right. So I'd like to take a second now and just kind of let's think about this whole substrate utilization thing as you sitting in your apartment being hungry. Okay, just follow me here. All right. So if we were to say that you being hungry is analogous to your body needing energy, okay, needing to resynthesize ATP to fuel exercise, all right, we would have varying levels of availability of food, in this case, or availability of substrate, and then there'd be varying degrees of difficulty for you to go and get food, okay, to fuel yourself. And it's basically the same way the body works, okay? So if we were to think about this, if you're sitting down in your couch and you're watching the TV or some sort of a show, computer, whatever you want to do, and you're hungry, hunger strikes. If you have food sitting right next to you, it's already made, I would wager, I would put lots of money on this, I would wager that you would just reach over, grab that food, grab the sandwich, put it in your mouth and eat it. It's a one-step process. It's right there, it's available, okay? That's your immediate system. The immediate system, the phosphagen, the myokinase system, collectively, that is that sandwich sitting right next to you, okay? It's in the sarcoplasm. It's right next to the sarcomere. The myosin actually has creatine kinase on the M line. Okay, so it's right there. It's available. You get bang for your buck. Easy. Now, as we start to maybe not having sandwich right next to us, okay, that's not on the table anymore. So we're moving away from the immediate system. Now let's talk about the glycolytic system. All right. So through glycolysis, it's a bit like if I were to have everything I needed to make a sandwich, and it was just in the kitchen. Okay. So maybe I at this point I say, okay, well, I'm going to get up, go to the kitchen, make a sandwich, eat it, bang, bang, boom. So there's a few more steps in the process. Okay, it's a little bit more work on my part, but it's still a pretty time efficient endeavor. Okay, now when that would be like anaerobic glycolysis. Now if we take the same thing, I want a sandwich, but I don't have all the parts I need. I might have to, go to the grocery store. Okay, so that would be a little bit more like aerobic metabolism. Okay, so if I was going to do aerobic metabolism or oxidative metabolism on that pyruvate that I'm getting from glycolysis, that would be a bit like if I were to go to the store, get all the parts I need, buy some bread, get some meat or cheese or whatever, so I can make my sandwich, drive home, and I'm good. And the reason I say that is it's a slower process to get energy out of glycolysis when it goes to the aerobic pathway, simply because that pyruvate then has to cross a membrane, go through several more steps, and then you get energy to actually use. Okay, so that's just, if we stick with the analogy, that's what that is. Now, if we were to say now we want to burn fats as a fuel source, burning fat, the reason you don't burn a lot of it while you exercise is simply that when you burn fat, if we take that sandwich example, it's a bit like as if I were to say, okay man, I really want a sandwich. So I'm going to go to a wheat field, grab some wheat, grind it up into flour, bake some bread, and then maybe I won't slaughter a cow, but I'll get some meat from somewhere, and then go home and make my sandwich. So it's more steps, it's more work, it's a slower process. Okay, fat utilization is difficult during exercise because there's more steps involved. Okay, the more membranes that a substrate has to cross in order to get to the place that it's going to be broken down, the slower it's going to be, just intrinsically. Okay, so if we're talking about breaking down fats, and I store most of my fat toward, the outside of my body, not directly in the muscle cell, then the problem I'm going to have is first I need to break down the fat, get it to the bloodstream. Okay, that's crossing a membrane already and having a whole process of lipolysis happen. Then it needs to circulate, be grabbed up by the muscle, which costs us ATP. Okay, then it needs to get shuttled in. Now we need to get it shuttled into the mitochondria, which is a whole nother process requiring another transport protein. And once we get there, then we have to perform beta oxidation, just so that we can get that acetyl-CoA molecule and start the process of aerobic metabolism. Okay, and it's a lot of work, and that's another big reason why you don't burn a lot of fat during exercise. But let's go ahead and let's go away from the Jimmy John's example, okay, the sandwich example, and now let's bring it back to our discussion of substrate utilization in a bit more of a concrete way. All right, so if we look at this graph, it's showing us that crossover concept. It's showing us different intensities of work here on the X, and on the Y we're having percentage of fuel sources used. Now, originally in the crossover concept diagram, you see fat versus carbohydrate, and this bar graph is roughly showing us the same, except it's including location. Okay, so it's including that idea of not only what are you going to use based on intensity, but where is that substrate going to be coming from? Okay, because once again, the more boundaries that a substrate has to cross, the slower it's going to be in utilization. So let's look at this a little bit. All right. So, exercise intensity at 25% of VO2 max, which, to put that in perspective, for many people, that is something like walking at a slow pace, maybe carrying groceries. Think very low intensity work. Okay, so when you're working at low intensity, you see here muscle glycogen, very, very, very small amount that's accounting for, right? Now muscle glycogens, that's glucose that's stored in the muscle, so right on site. All right. So now we're also having more plasma glucose. So that's being that our energy demands are actually pretty low, right? Because we're only working at 25%. We have the time, we have the ability to rely on glucose being taken up from the blood. Okay, and then we look here. Then we have plasma free fatty acid. Okay, all of this. Once again, it's not a problem to go through a slower process if you have the time to do it. Okay, so in this case, if I'm working at low intensity, no big deal. I can transport fat. I can do that whole lipolysis operation. It's not a big deal because energy demand is not really there. So your body can kind of afford to take its time. Okay, and then down here we have muscle triglycerides. So it is worth mentioning that you do store some fat in the muscle, just a very small amount. So you do have some fat storage in muscle, and we'll talk about it a bit more as we go, but just know that you do store some in the muscle. Now, let's look at all this a little further. Now we're going to move along to 65%. So 65%, if we know back from lactic threshold, we should be close to lactate threshold, if not over threshold at 65%. So now let's look at this. We're working hard enough that you're starting to feel a burn. Okay? Now, muscle glycogen. You're using a lot more of it. Okay? You're using more plasma glucose, and this is for total fuel usage. All right? So that's carb, okay? All this is carbohydrate versus fat. Whereas if we go back, this was carbohydrate versus fat on the bottom side. Okay, so you see we're burning a lot more carbohydrate versus fat. All right, and we're still able to draw fat or draw glucose from the blood. No big deal there. We're relying a lot more on glycogen. We're using, of the fats we're using, we're starting to use less circulating fat, and we're starting to use more stored fat within the muscle, right? And then when we look at working at 85%, so this is working at a pretty good clip, all right? This is working at an intensity where you're basically going to be out of breath for the majority of the time you're working. This is the hard portion of a cardio workout, all right? Think doing high intensity intervals for a period of time. All right, now if we look at this, here we have carbohydrate usage within this scale here, and then down here we have fat usage. Okay, so fat usage declining markedly at every increase in intensity, and then from here, I mean, the ratio is about the same, right? Here to there. Ratio is just a bit more on the glycogen usage side here, muscle glycogen. So what we're seeing is, especially with glucose, the proximity to muscle, or the not having to go from blood into muscle, makes a big difference to how much of each kind of glucose we're using, right? Because you see we're using a lot more glycogen as we start working harder. Okay, so that kind of covers intensity and a bit of the whole location aspect of this. But now let's talk about intensity. Duration, right? So as I mentioned, I believe earlier in this video, the duration of exercise relates to substrate availability, okay? And substrate availability then relates to substrate utilization. So let's look here at this graph here. We have fat versus carbohydrate metabolism, okay? Percentage of utilization of fats versus carbohydrate. So this, on the x-axis, we have time of exercise. So we have a duration of exercise. Someone has undertaken exercise, and it's rated here 65 to 75% of VO2 max. So a pretty good clip. It's a good workout zone there. All right. And what we see is initially you're burning more carbs, and over time carbohydrate utilization goes down quite a bit. Okay, somewhere about here, and you see about an approximate equal increase in fat utilization. Now this flies a bit in the face of the whole crossover concept, right? Because as we work harder, we should be burning more fats. Maybe duration could be seen by some as a modifier of intensity, but when we refer to exercise intensity, what we're referring to is the percentage of your maximal capacity. If it's lifting, we're talking about percentage of 1 RM. If we're talking about aerobic exercise or endurance work, we're going to talk about percentage of maybe heart rate max, or in this case VO2 max, right? And what we're seeing is carbohydrate utilization goes down over time, whereas fat utilization goes up. The reason for that is that as you're starting to work, as you work for, in this case, we're working for 100 minutes, okay? So hour and 2/3, okay? You can burn a significant amount of glycogen in that time, okay? So as your glycogen levels start to drop, your overall glucose levels will also start to be compromised. And as you start having less glucose in your body, less sugar in your body, you will start burning more fat, okay? because you're running out of glucose. And as you start to run out, your body, through its various hormone mixtures, which we'll touch upon in the endocrine unit, it will start to react by upregulating fat usage. Okay, so over time, we're burning less carbs and more fat because we're running out of carbs. Now this graph kind of takes the first one, that bar graph that I showed you, and it incorporates time of work. Okay, so first off, there's something I want to point out here. Okay, in general, an untrained person, such as, this is my guess, I didn't, of course, do these studies, but my guess is that, sorry, this study was done in untrained people. Okay, the reason being is it was only 100 minutes long. 100 minutes, or even less in some cases, is sufficient to glycogen deplete an untrained person. Okay, and also there's such a drastic decrease in glucose or carbohydrate is indicative of having lower training status. So, looking at this graph, the first thing we see here, this is time of work on the x-axis. Y-axis is percentage of energy expenditure. So once again talking about muscle glycogen versus blood glucose versus plasma fatty acids versus triglycerides. All right. Whoever did this study, the participants, they exercised for 4 hours at an intensity of 65 to 75%. That right away tells you that these people are trained, because an untrained person just can't go for 4 hours. So, anyway, looking at this, when we start exercise, we can see that about 45% of energy is coming from muscle glycogen, okay, and then about 50-ish% of it is just coming from fats, split roughly even between plasma-free fatty acids and muscle triglycerides, okay, and just a little bit coming from blood glucose. Okay, so as we go along and we look at this, in 1 hour, we've gone from 45% to maybe 35% of muscle glycogen. Blood glucose is double, maybe a little bit more. Okay, so we're running out of muscle glycogen. We're having reduction in muscle glycogen. So we're starting to rely more on blood glucose over time. Okay. Initially, muscle triglycerides were accounting for about half of the fat use. Now, that's dropped to maybe 20%, and now we've more fatty acids from the blood. So what we're seeing overall is that the amount of stuff coming from the blood is increasing, right? Because if we're talking about fatty acids, those are coming from fat stores around the body, and in most people, those are fairly inexhaustible. Not a fat joke, but at the same time, it's, yeah, you people store a lot of fat. It's a very high density energy storage unit, and most people will fatigue far before they run out of fat. It's just a biological fact. Blood glucose, we can make glucose through gluconeogenesis. We store it in the liver. Okay, we have means of, we could intake it. So, we're seeing that we're getting more things coming into the muscle cell because the things inside of the muscle cell are starting to deplete, because those are the first things being used, right? So at 2 hours, look at the difference. Okay, increase. Okay, 3 hours, that's when you're really starting a big decline. Then by 4 hours, muscle glycogen is gone. Muscle triglycerides are basically diminished. So now, the amount of substrate needing to come from circulating factors, be that glucose or fatty acids, is 90-ish%, whereas initially it was what, 25%? 30%, something like that. So what this graph shows us, that your takeaway from this is this experiment shows in no uncertain terms that your body will attempt to burn the thing that's closest to it first. Okay? Just as I talked about, if there's a sandwich next to you, you will eat the sandwich before you'll stand up and go make a new one. And if you had to choose between going out and buying stuff to make a sandwich or just going to your pantry to make it, you'll also do that. It's a big part of substrate utilization is how close is that substrate to the site of its being burned. Okay? Alright. So if we look here, we're looking at exhaustion versus time of work, and this kind of just reinforces the things we've been saying. Okay, a big point within fatigue and exhaustion is just understanding that the reason that you're fatiguing, for the most part, the reason that you're stopping exercise if you go for long enough, is that your blood glucose levels get low. Okay, and so if your blood glucose levels hit a certain point, you see there's about the same point here, you reach exhaustion. Reason being is your brain and your central nervous system require glucose as their primary fuel source. Okay, they almost have no other capacity to generate energy, and if you deplete glycogen, if you deplete your blood glucose levels enough, what's going to happen is your blood glucose gets low. Your brain starts essentially saying, hey, if you keep doing this, I'm going to run out of fuel. And if your brain runs out of fuel, you die, of course. So your brain, through many, many different systems, will essentially start signaling that it's time for you to stop. It's time for you to stop burning up all my energy. I need to preserve this glucose because the brain's going to get what it wants. And everything else is secondary. Alright, that's kind of how the body works. So here we can see working at different intensities. Okay, the higher intensity you work, the faster you fatigue. Well, I could have told you that. You could have told me that. It's pretty simple. But the reason being is that I'm starting to run out of glycogen. The harder I work, the faster I burn glycogen. The faster I burn glycogen, the sooner I fatigue. Okay, and that's somewhat attenuated or reduced with training status. Okay, so if we look here, we got a couple graphs. Okay, and both of these, the x-axis is duration of work. On our bottom one here, we have lactate release. So this is an indicator of how much pyruvate is going toward lactic acid versus pyruvate or aerobic metabolism. Okay, and then up here we have glucose uptake. So if we look at duration of work, this is 2 hours in both cases. All right, our trained people are in the solid line, and the dotted line is our untrained people, or non-trained. Okay, in aerobics again. So glucose uptake. A trained person doesn't uptake as much glucose initially. Okay, a big reason for that is that one of the probably the primary thing that through training you develop is an ability to burn more fat. And if you can burn fat instead of burning carbohydrate, well then we don't need as much. Okay, so that makes sense. You have less glucose uptake if you're more well trained. Okay, because you don't need as much, so you don't take up as much. An untrained person who doesn't have good aerobic capacity is going to burn glucose as early as it can and as much as it can. So you're going to see a lot of glucose uptake here. Okay, and after an hour of work, you see glucose uptake is about the same, and then at 2 hours, about the same as well. Okay, now let's look at where's that glucose even going. Okay, so lactate release. Untrained person, they're taking up a lot of glucose, and it's going straight to lactic acid production. Okay, so remembering back to those energy systems, if you're taking up glucose, you're burning glucose, but you're only producing lactic acid, or you're producing a lot of lactic acid as a result of that, you're not getting much energy efficiency out of it. Okay, and that goes down over time, and that probably has something to do with the fact that at an hour, 2 hours of work, an untrained person is going to start running out of glycogen. They're going to have to start burning more fat, and if you're burning more fat, you're having less lactate release. Okay. So looking here at a trained person, okay, trained person, they don't take up as much glucose to begin with. They do have lactic acid initially, and same deal. You see a reduction in lactic acid release, and that has to do with them losing glycogen. The more well trained you are, it means that you're burning less glycogen because you're able to burn more fat, but you're still burning glycogen, and glycogen has a very limited quantity in the body. Okay, so now if we take the same thing, same premise, training status, and now we're going to look at metrics of fat uptake and utilization. Okay, so there's a couple ways we can measure fat. One of the easier ways is to measure glycerol. Okay, so glycerol is part of that triglyceride unit. Okay, so as we've talked about a triglyceride is a glycerol head that's attached to 3 fatty acids. So it's a triglyceride, right? So if you have a lot of glycerol floating out in your body, in your blood, it is a decent indication that you've been breaking down triglycerides. Okay, so that's one way that we can measure the fat breakdown in a person. So if we look at this top graph, we have glycerol level, exercise duration, so 2 hours, same deal, trained versus non-trained, and we see that trained people have higher glycerol levels because they're better able to break down fat stores. Okay, untrained people, less glycerol, so they're burning almost all carbohydrate, and that's indicated by the last slides. We're looking at lactic acid release, glucose uptake, and then in this case glycerol levels are lower as well. And then if we cross-reference that with this, which is actual fatty acid uptake versus time of work, you see non-trained people take up less fatty acid versus their trained counterpart. Yeah. So if we relate this to the real world, to the the gym setting, if you will, for your average person who's just going to start working out, and they're going to get on a treadmill, they're going to get on a bike, and they're going to work hard for 20 or 30 minutes. If they're not trained, they're not burning a whole lot of fat, which can be very demoralizing to people, right? Because they see it as, their Rocky montage tape, where they're gonna get in that locker room, show up to the gym, put their stuff in their locker, go out there, they got their music going, they're feeling great. I'm going to burn some fat, I'm going to lose some pounds, it's time for spring break, it's time for that wedding, whatever. And they don't end up losing a lot of weight. And one of the biggest reasons there is if you're not trained, if you don't have a developed aerobic system, as you are working, your body's not even able to really burn fat very well. So one of the bigger steps is first developing an aerobic capacity, developing that mitochondrial density. Because once you have more mitochondria in your muscles, then you have a better propensity for burning fat. All right, and it just all it all comes down to rates here. Okay, so the thing is, if you have a less developed mitochondrial density in your muscles, then it's a bit like if I was trying to produce, I don't know, let's say automobiles. Okay, if I'm producing cars, it makes sense that if my factory was twice as large as my competitor, I would be able to produce twice as many cars. It's simple, right? It's bigger, I have more workers, I have more material to work with, I have more space to work with, my manufacturing line is bigger, I can produce more cars. Okay? The mitochondria, it's kind of the same deal, okay? If the mitochondria is bigger, if you have more space in the mitochondria, it also means that you probably have more mitochondrial enzymes. So all the enzymes that govern the Krebs cycle and the electron transport system and beta oxidation, all those enzymes that make those bioenergetic pathways work are in higher concentration. So you're better able to react with substrates. So if a fat comes into the mitochondria, you can process it faster and you have more free enzymes allowing you to do that work at a greater rate. Okay? So a trained person, when they start to work, there's a number of reasons that account for this, but essentially their increased mitochondrial density, their increased aerobic capacity allows them to burn fat earlier and more of it throughout an exercise bout, and in doing so, from a weight loss perspective, yeah, they burn more fat. But from a training and performance perspective, if you're burning fat instead of glycogen, then you're saving your glycogen. Okay, that's one of the core reasons why I come back to it again. Glycogen preservation, glucose preservation is one of the central drives within exercise physiology. And here you see, from an adaptive perspective, your body is adapting to save glycogen. Okay, so the next thing we'll talk about is diet. Okay, so one of the pillars of this whole thing, right? So if we're going to talk about substrate availability, we already talked about intensity of work and duration of work and all that kind of stuff. Now let's talk about diet, okay? Because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how I train, my diet is going to greatly influence my results, but also how my next training session goes, right? So in this case, there are some studies done, and this is minutes of work here at the bottom x-axis. It's hard to see because of the way this pen thing works. Anyway, if we look here, this is it goes to the same unit. So it's 4 hours, 3 hours, 2 hours, and then 60 minutes right here. Okay, and then zeros right here. So they had people. They put them in 3 different groups. Okay, the first group is a mixed diet. So this is just a typical diet: fats and carbs and protein and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and then they had a carbohydrate diet, which was very, very heavy in carbs. Okay, and then here we have fat and protein, so very little carbohydrate. And what you see is this is the ability to work over time. So if you fed somebody a mixed diet, you see that they burn a good amount of fat and it's carbohydrate, and they're able to work for 3 hours. Okay. When someone was fed a strictly carbohydrate diet, they burned more carbs, less fat, and they were able to work for 4 hours. In the group where people didn't eat carbohydrates at all, they burned almost all fat, but they were only able to work for 90 minutes maximal. And these are in trained people again. Okay? So that's a pretty big difference. One, in what you're burning. Okay? If you eat more fat, you burn more fat. If you eat more carbohydrates, you burn more carbohydrates. Okay? So in what they're burning, but also the ability to work harder. Okay? This middle one here is some of the basis behind why people will say to carb load prior to athletic events. And that's something we're going to touch on a bit later in this lecture, but that just goes to show you. Right? And this bottom one here, if you've ever been around a bodybuilder or a fighter, be it a wrestler, grappler, MMA, what have you, anybody who's trying to make weight, or in the case of a bodybuilder specifically, they'll cut out carbohydrate intake for periods of time prior to a competition, with the goal of losing body fat. They don't have much capacity to work. Exercise in a carbohydrate depletion state is terrible, for lack of a better term. It doesn't feel good. You have no energy. It's really, really, really hard to hit any kind of an intense workout without carbohydrate because you need carbohydrate. You rely on carbohydrate to such an extent that it's just your body really doesn't function well without it. Okay, so now I'd like to talk about nitrogen balance a little bit. Okay, so nitrogen balance, and I just throw this in here because it's something you should be aware of. It's not exceptionally important that you know everything about it, but it's a very simple idea. Okay, part of the idea of exercising and say gaining muscle or losing muscle and all that is the idea of nitrogen balance. Okay, um, so if you're ever gonna burn protein um, as a substrate, the thing is before you can burn protein, it has to be deaminated. And one of the unique things about protein as a macronutrient is that it contains an amino group. It contains nitrogen. Fats and carbohydrates do not contain nitrogen. So, anyway, there's this idea of nitrogen balance. Okay, and nitrogen balance speaks to how much nitrogen, which is analogous to protein, are you taking in through your diet, and then how much nitrogen are you losing through expulsion from the body, um, removal, um, and that's kind of how it's studied. Actually, if you're going to study nitrogen balance, you'll study exactly how much food someone eats, and then when they defecate, people will take that and they'll have to figure out how much nitrogen was in that. Okay, that's how you determine nitrogen balance. But the relevance is that if you can determine nitrogen balance, you can determine if somebody is in an anabolic state or a catabolic state. Okay, or somewhere in the middle. So if nitrogen levels coming in, okay, if nitrogen levels coming in equal those going out, we say they're in a in a neutral nitrogen balance. Okay, your protein synthesis equals protein degradation. Whereas if you are in a catabolic state, okay, catabolic meaning you're burning more protein than you are making protein, what you're going to see is something like this, okay, right here, okay, where compared to where you started, you have less nitrogen um, coming in versus leaving your body. So you're in a negative state. And then after a while, after recuperation here from exercise, you start seeing a positive nitrogen balance, and that would indicate anabolism, building muscle. Okay, you're storing protein. You store protein typically as muscle or other protein, other structures in the body. So to put this in a nutshell, nitrogen balance essentially just speaks to, from a whole body state, are you building protein or are you breaking down protein as a net? So if we look at nitrogen balance as how it relates to diet, here we can see that this is done in athletes, um, and they had young and old, and anyway, they just gave them different diets, different amounts of protein in their diet. Okay. So, first off, recommended daily amount of protein is zero point 0.8 grams per kilogram of your body weight per day, right? It's a far cry from 1 gram per pound. It's less than half of that, okay? So, anyway, that's what's recommended. And here they gave them 0.9 versus, this is 0.12, okay? And what they found was, looking at nitrogen balance, those who ate more protein had higher nitrogen balances. They're more positively nitrogen balanced. Those who ate a deficient diet, a lower than recommended amount, had a negative nitrogen balance, which should be indicative of losing muscle. Okay. Now, I know what maybe some of you are thinking. You're just drawing this line out like, okay, if we just keep eating more protein, we're going to be off the chart protein gains. Not necessarily the case, okay? You can even see with this, these guys are eating a lot more protein than one another, but the differences aren't really that much, okay? So there is here a dose response, but I would wager instead of you getting that, exponential growth, it would look a little bit more like this, okay? And then it would kind of just be plateaued out, right? All right, so back to glycogen. So let's look at glycogen storage time and replenishment. So it's very important that athletes and people who do intensive aerobic exercise be given plenty of time to recuperate in between intensive bouts of work. Okay, and this study here shows this is working one day after the other, doing 16-kilometer runs. Okay, so 10-mile runs. So 10 miles day one, they measured glycogen prior and then after. So you could see a drop in glycogen level, okay, from there to there. Now, day two, they weren't given a day of rest. Glycogen levels started up so they had a little bit of recovery, went to here, and then dropped to here. So, more drop. And then day two to day three, no real recovery, but still more depletion. Okay. So the cumulative effect of this is a significant drop in the amount of stored glucose in the body. And the problem with this is where you start running into overtraining in endurance sports, is if people don't give themselves enough time to rest, they don't have enough time to replenish muscle glycogen. And that will have a significantly negative effect on subsequent performance. So if you're practicing and every day you just practice, and you don't have days off, what's going to happen eventually is your performance is going to drop off, and it may become more problematic as an overuse syndrome kind of sets in, or it may just be that you're not able to practice at all because you don't have the right energies for it. At the end of the day, you're going to have a blunted performance. So if we go back to that, this is giving them 1 day rest, and after that 1 day rest, you can see the body has essentially almost recouped back to normal. So if we look at glucose, okay, and glycogen, and how we're going to preserve muscle glycogen, what we see here is that intaking or ingesting glucose during exercise is beneficial to maintaining blood glucose levels and also retaining work performance. Okay, because once again, one way that we can preserve glycogen is by using more blood glucose. Okay, so something that's come about in probably the last 2-3 decades has been the idea of drinking sugar or intaking food while you work out, and that way you can have more of it in your system and then save your glycogen. So if we look at blood glucose, this is taking in glucose as you work versus not. Okay, so when you take glucose, your blood glucose levels stay higher versus when you don't. And then down here we have ingestion of glucose, okay, and how that affects, or rather the timing of things. Ingesting glucose about a little less than an hour into work, and then looking at how that affects your blood glucose. Okay, so a little bit over an hour into work. Okay, you see, ability to work is about the same, matched with the non-glucose group here, but toward the end of work, they have a higher amount. They're better able to retain glucose levels later in work, whereas these guys, in the non-glucose group, they start to have a significant reduction in blood glucose. Now, you got to be careful with taking in sugar prior to working out, because it can actually have a couple significantly negative effects. Okay, one of those is that you might have an insulin spike. So insulin is a hormone that essentially causes your muscles to store things, mostly glucose. Okay, so if if you take in too much sugary stuff right before you work out, what happens is blood glucose levels spike up, and if blood glucose levels get high enough, then insulin levels will respond by increasing as well. Your pancreas will produce insulin, and what happens is that insulin then tells your muscles to pull up all the blood glucose, and what you can have is kind of a crash. Okay, this crash is like the coming off a sugar high kind of thing, where you had ate, I don't know, a piece of candy or something, and maybe 20-30 minutes later you kind of feel like suppressed, maybe sleepy. That's the crash that's related to insulin. And you don't want to have that right before you work out. Okay? So it's important, if you're going to take a carbohydrate prior to work, that you should probably try to take a higher glycemic index carb, a more complex carb, because it takes longer to digest. And that's important. Though the thing you have to kind of balance out is, if you take something that's too hard to digest, then your GI tract has a hard time breaking it down, and then you could have cramping, gastrointestinal distress, problems. So that's the fine balance you run. Taking in glucose prior to work is good for your work performance, so long as you take it at the right time and you're taking the right kind of carb. But you have to also make sure you're not going to blunt your performance because you have a stomach ache or something due to what you ate. So now let's talk about glycogen supercompensation, or another term is glycogen loading. Okay, so this phenomenon was discovered actually in a researcher, as I understand it. A researcher did this to himself. One leg he glycogen depleted, the other one he didn't. Essentially, what we find with this is glycogen depletion will lead to a subsequent supercompensation, as it's called. Okay, so if you take somebody and you exercise a muscle, or most of their body, to the point where their muscle glycogen levels are almost gone, they're just bottomed out, what's going to happen in response is, as you eat a bunch of carbohydrate afterwards, that muscle that was depleted will then start to supercompensate and store more glycogen than it was able to before. Okay, and that's depicted here in this graph. You can see that this is days here on the x-axis, glycogen on the y, and our control here is just these dotted open circles, supercompensation in the solid black here. Okay, so in this case, they depleted themselves, ate a bunch of carbohydrates. You see a compensation occur, and then it stays elevated for a little while, a few days. So here's a more in-depth study looking at different means of supercompensation and the subsequent glycogen loading or glycogen storage. And what you look at here is 3 popular means of depleting glycogen, or rather doing a supercompensation. So this is more of what carb loading is. Okay, if everybody says, "Oh, I'm doing carb loading is like before you do a marathon or a half or something like that, a distance event. People might say, "Oh, I'm going to go out to eat a bunch of pasta. Eat a bunch of pasta before I work out, before my run tomorrow. That way I have more energy." That's procedure 1 here. Okay, that's it. That is, they had a normal diet, and then the day before, they ate a ton of carbohydrate, and what you see here is more glycogen loading, okay, more storage. And then we have procedure 2. This is more of a classical model where they fed them a normal diet, then they worked them to the point of depletion, and then afterward fed them a carbohydrate based diet, and you see more compensation, okay, a lot more, okay, even more so than this one, okay, that versus that. And in the third procedure, they fed them a mixed diet, normal diet, worked them, but did not feed them carbohydrates until 4 days. Okay, and in doing so, you're seeing glycogen levels stayed suppressed because they're only eating fats and carbohydrate. Fats and protein. But the subsequent supercompensation was the greatest. So in this case, what we're seeing is the longer the body is deprived, or the muscle is deprived of carbohydrate, the greater the compensation will be on the back end. Okay? So, you can take what you will out of this. Realistically, the first model, the first design, is really the only one most people are going to be willing to do. For a couple reasons. If I'm working hard enough to glycogen deplete, I'm probably not able to do any kind of skills practice, like if I'm going to do a competition of some sort. So it's more important that I'm fresh and able to do the work, maybe in this sort of a model where I never really deplete, than it is for this to get a ton of glycogen, but spend 4 days being laid up because I have no carbohydrate, not being able to practice. So it's kind of an individual thing as to what's ideal, but I would lean toward procedure 1. Also, this idea of glycogen supercompensation occurs in the liver. Liver, once again, is one of the 2 key places in the body where you store glycogen, those being muscle and liver. Okay, so they did the same thing. But instead, you can't really exercise a liver, except for those who go out on Thursday night or what have you. Anyway, in this case, they gave them carbohydrate starvation, so went on kind of a ketogenic or Atkins kind of diet, only feeding protein and fat. And what you see is it doesn't take long, a couple days, glycogen levels will start to drop out in the liver, and when they go to refeed, the magnitude of compensation is quite high. Okay, so you can glycogen load the liver as well. Just requires starving yourself of carbohydrate for a while prior. Okay, so now let's look at training effects and bioenergetics. From the broadest of senses, when you're training aerobic sports, when you're running or jogging or anything along that lines, the only thing that's going to make you improve is by inducing fatigue. And that fatigue has to be specific to the energy system you're trying to use for that event. Okay? So, if I'm trying to be a better runner, a distance runner, if I want to do a 10K really well, let's say, which isn't really long distance, but it's long enough. Okay? If I want to do a 10K, I need to be stressing my glycolytic system, and I need to be stressing my aerobic system. I have to be putting those systems under enough stress that I'm causing a lot of fatigue, and that fatigue will essentially function as a catalyst or a stimulus that will induce a response. Okay. In the case of aerobics, it would be greater mitochondrial density, a number of the things we're about to look at. Okay. If you're doing anaerobic training, power type events, or high power type events, you can also train bioenergetic systems. In this case, you're probably going to want to train your glycolytic capacity and also your immediate system. Here's where it gets a little bit hairy. Okay, if you want to train your aerobic system, you have to make sure that you don't engage your aerobic system too much. Okay, Because if you're just trying to work anaerobically, if you're trying to work those high power energetic systems, then you need to give those systems a lot of time to recover. Because if you don't, if you have too little recovery time, then you end up actually training your aerobic system. And if you're training your aerobic system, by definition, you're going to be hurting your anaerobic or power pathways. So, major adaptations within aerobic training. The big one, increased mitochondrial density. Okay, so if you're increasing mitochondrial density, you're increasing the size of that warehouse. Okay, so a bigger warehouse, a bigger mitochondria gives you more oxidative enzymes. It also increases your ability for that NADH to function. Okay, that transport of NADH, so that the shuttles are improved. You're also reducing the amount of hydrogen in the sarcoplasm. Okay, because if your mitochondria is working better, it's taking up those hydrogens. Remember back to the electron transport system. Electron transport actually directly uses hydrogen to produce energy. So you're dropping the amount of hydrogen, which is also making you less acidic, and it means that you're going to have a harder time becoming having a systemic acidosis. Essentially, you won't have metabolic fatigue in that sense. So, yeah, net result from all this, you can burn fat more readily, you reduce metabolic acidosis, you reduce lactic acid concentrations, and helps you to maintain glycogen for longer, which allows you to work at a higher intensity for longer. Okay, so when you look at the crossover concept and we impose the idea of training effect, this is essentially what happens. Okay, the least trained you are, this crossover point will be further to the left. Okay, because once again, an untrained person is going to use carbohydrates much more readily and faster than a trained person will. Because a trained person, their body is developed and adapted to preserve carbohydrates and burn fat. So you could guess here, you see the same, all right? If I'm more trained, the crossover point might be somewhere like here or here. Okay? The further that crossover point is, the better it's going to be for preservation of carbohydrate. Because if I'm using less carbs, I'm able to store more of it. It's just that simple. Okay, so now we're going to look at some individual factors. I'll give you the cliff notes of this. Pretty much everything goes up with training. Okay, so here we have a bunch of different studies that they range from 8 to 20 weeks or more, and they look at different factors and how they're increased with training. Okay, so here we have percent increase of ATP and creatine phosphate in muscle. Higher concentrations of ATP, 25% more ATP stored in the muscle, 40% more creatine phosphate. So those two things together mean you have a much greater capacity for doing anaerobic work. Okay, now we look to that, the same systems. We see we have an increase in the myokinase, MK is myokinase enzyme, and about a, once again, 35-40% increase in, this is CPK, creatine kinase enzyme, catalyzing that phosphation system. Right? So, looking at fiber typing over time, pure distance, long distance people have the highest concentration of slow twitch or type 1 fiber. Untrained people will have the next highest concentration of area, not percentage of or like ratio, it's fiber area. Okay. Middle distance, jumpers, discus, sprinters. Sprinters have the highest percentage of type 2 by area. Okay, now we're going to look at the glycolytic system. This is 20 weeks of training. Um, this is storage of muscle glycogen. So just how much muscle glycogen do you store? After training, you see a significant increase. This is like 3 times as much glycogen being stored, almost. Okay. Now we look at the enzymes which kind of govern glycolysis. Okay. So HK is hexokinase, PFK is phosphofructokinase. Not super important, you know that, but with training, you see about a 60% increase in hexokinase and over 100% increase in PFK. Both of those things combined, what that's telling you is with training, with doing aerobic type work, you're seeing increases in these enzymes which are going to let those pathways go faster. Taken together, that means you're able to produce energy more rapidly and maintain paces better. Okay, so more with that. So this is gluconeogenic enzyme or gluconeogenic factors. Alanine is an amino acid that's used within the gluconeogenesis, and then lactate once again can be used as well. So you have a faster conversion of alanine and lactic acid to glucose through gluconeogenesis. Okay, this is more storage within muscle. Okay, glycogen storage is up, triglyceride storage is up. It's one of those strange paradoxes within within the field is that there's only two disease state, or there's only two like major classifications of people who store a lot of fat in their muscles. One of those is a diabetic. Diabetics don't consume glucose very well, so instead they'll store fat in the muscle, which just gives them an alternate fuel source to carbohydrate. And a trained person, they just store more of it. The thought is that if they store more, then they have more of it to burn when they go to do high intensity work. Alright, so more things here. This is in the oxidative realm. Myoglobin. Myoglobin is responsible for sequestering oxygen to the within a muscle cell. Okay, pyruvate handling enzymes. Okay, so the enzymes which help to catalyze or get pyruvate to become acetyl-CoA. Beta oxidation enzymes. All of them very, very large increases. Taken together, this will increase the capacity of aerobic metabolism greatly. Okay, lipolysis. So beyond the fact that a trained person is better able to burn fat because they have more mitochondria, they have more beta oxidation enzymes, they have more transport factors, they also break down fat in the body faster. Okay, they're better at it. They're better at breaking down stored fat. So that's a reason to do cardio. Okay, looking at that mitochondria, you see the size of mitochondria increases, the number increases, and taken together with that you have more enzymes as well. So let's look at shuttling factors. So carnitine. Carnitine is that factor that shuttles fat from the sarcoplasm into the mitochondria, and you see here with training that increases. Glycerol phosphate shuttle, the hydrogen shuttle, that increases as well, which makes the cell better able to get as much energy as possible, and also to oxidize NAD to get the hydrogen off of it. So very important. And last but not least, well, within the realm of training, let's talk about detraining. Okay, so detraining is is the condition of, stopping exercise. So with the study here, they had people who were untrained. They trained them for a period of 5 weeks, and then about half of them stopped for a week. Okay, and then that group was split up and again. So, but within 1 week of not training, you had a pretty big drop in performance, right? About half. If you look at this from where they started, it's about half of what they gained you lost within a week. This is doing aerobic training. Okay, this is not like muscle. Okay, this isn't muscle gain or anything. This is the enzymes relating to aerobic capacity, mitochondrial density, that sort of thing. Okay, so you lose it very fast. Now, the good side is you also recover pretty quickly. Here they took half the group and retrained them, and within 4 weeks they were pretty much back to where the other group had been maintained. But you see here, for the group that did not start to retrain, they went back to resting conditions. They didn't have any long-term effects. So, with most things in the body, if you don't continue training, you will just lose it if you don't use it. Okay, so last little bit that I got to touch on in the bioenergetics unit. This will be pretty quick. Let's look at excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. We can either see that or EPOC. That's the short term for it. So we'll go with EPOC. Okay, so EPOC, or once again, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, is defined as the total oxygen consumed following exercise in excess of baseline levels. Okay, so what this means is, if you were to think about yourself, if I told you to, run a mile as fast as you could, after you finished running, after you crossed the finish line, gave me a nasty scowl, and then, we're kind of like recovering, you would be breathing really fast. You would be still having a fast heart rate and having to, ventilate or breathe faster than normal. Okay, so at that point you're consuming more oxygen than you need because you're no longer working, right? Because you've stopped exercising. You may be sitting down, laying down, slowly walking in circles or something, but you're not burning a lot of energy, but you're still breathing a lot. Okay, so this little bit right here, if we look at y-axis being oxygen consumption, okay, and then x being time, what we would see if I were to hook you up to an indirect calorimeter is that for the first bit of exercise, you have a period where you're trying to approach steady state. Steady state being when your aerobic system is primarily engaged, and that aerobic system is producing the majority of the energy. That's kind of what we call steady state. In order to get to steady state, we got to have those other energy systems activate first, and the byproducts of those energy systems kind of help to get you to steady state. Now, there's a lot of stuff going on during recovery from exercise, and for that reason, the rate of recovery has a lot to do with how intense the exercise was to begin with. Okay, so if you're doing something like a step test or something that's pretty short and low intensity, you recover very rapidly. But the harder you start working, the longer it takes to recover. And you've probably all experienced that. If you work out really, really hard, you might still be breathing heavy 5 minutes, 10 minutes afterwards, because it's taking your body longer to recover, and that extra oxygen that's being consumed is typically, there's a lot of different things going on, but it's typically being used to pay back some sort of an oxygen debt, or recover your anaerobic systems, which were taxed in that process of ramping up to steady state. So, as I said, if we talk about this idea of steady state, that's the point where you're oxidative system is able to produce enough ATP to meet the energetic demands of your um, steady velocity work. Okay. Now, the magnitude, or rather the intensity of your work, directly affects the magnitude of the epoch, right? So I said this already. The the harder you work, the longer you're going to have a recovery, but also the harder you work also influences the rate of you getting to steady state. Because if we remember back to some of the things we've talked about, these different energy systems tend to prime each other. They feed forward. So if I have a lot of metabolism, a lot of immediate system, a lot of glycolytic happening, those two will prime the oxidative system to work better. So the more the harder I work, essentially, the faster I'm going to hit steady state to a certain extent.